The sky turned black, and the desert began to scream. Forced into a hidden cave to escape the deadliest storm of the century, one lone cowboy found himself surrounded by 10 Apache women. He expected a fight for his life, but as the thunder shook the earth, the eldest stood up, placed a feathered spear at his feet, and whispered the words that would change the frontier forever. "The storm has chosen. Now you are our chief." The sky didn't just turn dark. It turned a bruised and angry purple that looked like a fresh wound. Elias pulled his collar up against his neck and felt the first sting of sand against his cheek. He had seen storms in the high desert before, but nothing like this. The wind wasn't just blowing. It was screaming through the rock formations like a choir of ghosts. His horse Barnaby was shivering under him. The animal's ears were flat against his head, and he refused to take another step toward the open flats. Elias didn't blame him. To the west, a wall of dust 1,000 feet high was eating the horizon. It swallowed the sun and left the world in a strange orange twilight that felt like the end of days. Elias dismounted and grabbed the bridle. He needed a hole to crawl into, or the grit would fill his lungs before the hour was up. He scanned the jagged face of the mesa. He saw a flicker of light. It was high up among the red rocks and tucked behind a heavy overhang. It was a campfire. He led Barnaby up a narrow trail that was slick with loose shale. Every gust of wind threatened to push them off the edge. His eyes were burning and his throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of dry needles. Just as the main wall of the storm hit the mountain, he threw himself into the mouth of a wide cavern. The air inside was cool and smelled of old smoke and cedar. Elias leaned against the stone wall and tried to catch his breath. He wiped the dust from his eyes and looked deeper into the shadows. He wasn't alone. 10 pairs of eyes were watching him from the circle of a small fire. They were Apache women, and they held their knives and rifles with the steady hands of people who had already seen too much of death. Elias let go of his horse and raised his empty hands. He had escaped the wrath of the heavens only to walk into the judgment of men. The wind outside the cave didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like a freight train crashing into the mountain. Elias stood perfectly still as the dust from his coat settled onto the stone floor. He kept his hands open and away from the pistol at his hip. He knew that in a space this tight, a bullet wouldn't care who it hit. The 10 women didn't move. The fire in the center of the circle was small and fed by dry mesquite roots. It cast long and dancing shadows against the cave walls. The eldest woman sat directly across from him. Her face was a map of deep lines, and her white hair was tied back with a strip of buckskin. She held an old repeating rifle across her knees, and her finger was resting just outside the trigger guard. Elias looked at the others. There were mothers holding quiet children and younger women with eyes like flint. They were surrounded by woven baskets and heavy bundles wrapped in buffalo hide. He realized then that they weren't just hiding from the storm. They were carrying the history of their people in those packs. The silence was so thick it felt like the smoke from a fire. Elias took a slow breath and let it out. He didn't speak because he didn't have the words that would fix this. He just reached over and untied the heavy cinch on Barnaby's saddle. He pulled the leather off the horse's back and set it on the ground. It was his way of saying he wasn't planning on running and he wasn't planning on fighting. The old woman watched him for a long time. She looked at his calloused hands and the way he treated his horse. Finally, she gave a small nod. The other women didn't drop their guard, but the air in the cave changed. It went from the edge of a blade to the weight of a heavy blanket. They were all prisoners of the mountain now. The hours crawled by as the storm hammered the mountain outside. The cave entrance was a wall of swirling brown dust, and the sound was a constant low moan. Inside the circle of 10 women, Elias sat with his back against the cold stone. He had shared the last of his dry jerky and a handful of coffee beans he kept in his saddlebag. They didn't talk much, but they watched him with eyes that were starting to lose their edge. One of the younger women was holding a small child whose cough sounded like dry leaves. Elias noticed her struggling to keep the girl warm. He reached over and shoved his heavy sheepskin coat toward her. She looked at him with a startled expression before pulling the coat around the child. The child settled and the tension in the cave dipped just a little more. Elias watched the fire. He thought about how the world outside was being erased by the wind. In here there was no ranch and no trail. There was just the smell of wood smoke and the steady breathing of 10 people who were trying to see the morning. He realized that in the dark everyone is the same color and everyone prays to the same silence. The fire burned low as the storm reached its peak. The mountain itself seemed to groan under the weight of the wind. The eldest woman, Nana, stood up slowly. Her joints popped like dry twigs. She walked to the center of the circle and looked at Elias. Her eyes were not looking at his face but through it. She began to speak in a low voice that rumbled like distant thunder. Elias didn't know the tongue, but he felt the weight of the words. One of the younger women, who knew a bit of English, began to whisper the meaning. She spoke of a story passed down through 5 generations. It was a story of a white man born of iron and dust who would come when the sky cried tears of sand. Nana reached into a heavy leather bundle. She pulled out a mantle made of eagle feathers and dyed buckskin. She stepped toward Elias and draped it over his shoulders. The weight of it was surprising. It smelled of old cedar and sage. Elias tried to stand, but she placed a firm hand on his chest. "You stay," she said in a voice that was surprisingly clear. "The storm has cleared the path, and it has chosen the guard. Our men are gone to the great hunt, and the hunters of the plains are coming for what we carry." She pointed to the sacred scrolls and the turquoise artifacts. They weren't just running from the wind. They were running from men who wanted to strip their history for gold. They needed a man who knew the ways of the white man's guns but held the heart of the desert. Elias looked at the 10 faces surrounding him. They weren't asking him to be a king. They were asking him to be the shield between them and the world that wanted to erase them. He looked at the mantle and then at his own scarred hands. He nodded once. The choice was made. The storm finally began to lose its teeth as the gray light of dawn filtered through the dust. Elias stood up and felt the weight of the feathered mantle on his shoulders. He didn't feel like a chief yet, but he felt the eyes of 10 women waiting for him to move. He walked to the cave entrance and looked at the mountain pass. The wind had reshaped the land and the old trails were gone. He turned back to the circle. He didn't give a speech. He just pointed to the heavy bundles and then to the strongest of the pack horses. "Pack them light," he said with a steady hand. "We move high and stay in the rocks." The women moved with a sudden and quiet efficiency. They didn't question him. Elias checked his Winchester and then looked at the horizon. He could see a thin line of riders far to the south. The bounty hunters were already moving. His first command wasn't about power. It was about survival. He led them out of the cave and into the sharp morning air. He wasn't riding for himself anymore. He was the shield for 10 lives and a history that couldn't be replaced. The climb into the high country was slow and punishing. Elias led the small caravan through narrow gaps in the granite where the wind still whistled like a warning. Behind him, the 10 women moved with a rhythmic grace, their moccasins making no sound on the sun-baked stone. They didn't look back at the dust clouds on the horizon where the bounty hunters had finally lost the trail. The desert had swallowed their tracks, and the mountain had hidden their passage. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, they reached the hidden valley. It was a place of deep green grass and cold, clear springs that bubbled out of the earth. It was a sanctuary that the maps of the white man had never touched. Elias pulled Barnaby to a halt and looked out over the meadow. He felt the weight of the eagle feather mantle on his shoulders, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a second skin. Nana walked up beside his horse. She didn't say a word, but she placed a hand on his stirrup and looked at the valley. The younger women began to unpack the sacred bundles, their voices rising in a soft song that seemed to harmonize with the wind in the pines. Elias looked at his scarred hands and then at the women who now called him their leader. He was a man who had spent his life running from his own shadow, but here, in the silence of the high peaks, he had finally found a reason to stand still. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was the guardian of a people, and the frontier ahead of him was no longer a wasteland, but a home.